So now that we've gone over sort of an overview with the paint room, I want to go into a little bit more depth in terms of the tools that I tend to use and some of the problems I run into. So this is more or less a long-standing issue that you need to be aware of is if for some reason you want to paint with specularity and fill the entire model with that specularity, usually what you can do is go up to freeze and say fill unfrozen or press the insert key. But what I find is when you do that, it fills completely with black, and all I wanted was the specularity. So for some reason that occurs, and I don't know exactly why. I don't think it's intentional. I'm gonna actually try and experiment by taking the opacity completely down, and it still happens. So I do find that a little annoying, and I have brought it up as a feature improvement that I think needs to happen. To me, actually, it's more of a bug because I don't think that's how it's intended to work. So that's something to avoid. The other thing to point out is that the layers that were exported when I did my merge with NM per pixel from the Retopo room is I have this normal map thing going here. So if I want to paint depth information, so let's turn off our specularity. In fact, let's just leave that one on, and let's turn on the depth as well. If I paint in depth here, what you'll see is I'm able to actually paint in what looks to be a deformative property on the spider. But if you look at it from both sides, I've changed nothing. And in fact, if I were to undo that and say, let's just look at it from the side, you can see how this ridge goes. In fact, I'll just sort of draw along this ridge. It goes here like this, okay? Now, if I were to go in and paint on that area, you would think that it would raise it up. I mean, this looks like a big bump, but for some reason, it's not changing it. And the reason that is it's a normal map. It's faking it. It's not real. So you can use this software to bake normals, but you can also use this software to paint them in after the fact, which is a very handy feature for game artists like myself. Now, if you want to use a deformative destructive process, so to speak, and I don't want to say destructive, but it's probably the best term, you can use a displacement map. But in that case, what you would want to have done is thought about that at this point and said, merge for per pixel painting with displacement. But in this case, I'm not worried about that. Another way to demonstrate this is if I go into wireframe by pressing 4, I can toggle the wireframe on and off. If I were to do this and paint that bump in, there's no change in the geometry itself. Nothing happens to the vertices at all. So we can see that it's a normal map and it's not being displaced. Okay? But having baked these layers out, right? These are two layers that came from the Retopo room. I had a spider group and a spider's eyes group, or spider eyes group. Now what happened was that it created an object called spider_spider eyes. It gave me two submaterials, which are spider default and spider eyes default. And then it gave me these two layers. And in fact, it even threw in a default layer, which I'm not quite sure why. But these two layers affect the spider eyes and the spider's body. But one thing you'll notice, if you were to paint on this model or not, and then export it, you might find that when you bring it into another application, it looks kind of dark. Now, I can't explain why, because I think the developer meant for this to happen this way, but I and a few other users have requested this be changed. The layer blend modes over here default, when they bake over, to multiply for these layers. So if I change this to standard blend and go down to spider and change that one to standard blend, and then try to change anything in here or just leave them as they are and then put them in the same application I had before where it was looking a little dark, now it should look exactly as I intended, or pretty close if I brought it in properly. So in this case, we're going to start working on the actual tools that I typically use. Those two problems are things that I tend to find kind of frustrating, especially when you're a new user. So one of the tools that I also use, and it's not so much a tool as it is a feature, is the lighting. Now, the lighting works really well in the paint room. This is the ambient lighting. That should affect the lighting of the object or scene as a whole. This next one over is your basically your point light or primary light. And so if I were to affect the, say, overall lighting here, but then change my point lighting, you'll see that my shadows become darker and my lighting at the top become really intense because I'm affecting that primary light, and that's that third button over allows me to move that around. So you're going to want to play with these settings to see how lighting plays with your model. Now, the white areas, when you have ambient lighting on, get really white. So I tend to turn that down to maybe about 20%, maybe 15%. It depends. And then I'll take the primary light up and move it to an area that I think will help me see what I'm trying to do. So if for some reason I'm moving the primary light and I really like it back here, which I do. If I really like it back here where it's really making these shadows pop and these bumps pop, the problem is I can't see what I'm painting in the dark areas. So I can turn up the ambient lighting a bit so that I can tweak and see and paint areas that are a little harder to see, and that's why those are useful. Okay, the next thing that I tend to use a lot is the paintbrush. Obviously, you're going to use that to paint. So you can press X to switch these colors over here, your foreground and background colors, just like you can in Photoshop. So let's say I want to paint on the spider eyes, and I'm on the spider eyes layer here. Let me go to just color. And so I have red selected here, and I want to paint the eyes red and the body black. If I'm on the spider eyes layer, it stands to reason that if I paint on the spider eyes, I'm going to paint on just the spider eyes. But that is not actually the case. So let's take the opacity up to 100% so we can see what we're doing. And if I paint over here, you'll notice I'm actually able to paint on the body too, and I didn't want to do that. The reason that's happening is these layers affect the entire scene. If you just want to paint on the eyes, then you'll have these what are called sub-materials or sub-objects. They're not labeled that way when I dragged them in here, when I went to Windows pop-ups, but that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for, actually, I think it's just named objects. No, it is sub-objects. So you have sub-objects and object materials. And so that's what these are. So objects and object materials. So it's a little, and this is one of the things that's a little bit confusing with 3D Coat. If I want to just affect the eyes, I should go to freeze and either freeze material or freeze sub-object. If I chose material and selected eyes, I would get just that. But we just said we wanted to paint the eyes red, and I'm on the spider eyes layer where I want to be. So if I want to fill instead the other part, I could have just chosen the body. But if for some reason I don't have it selected, what I can do, and just like in Photoshop, is press Control, or I believe on the Mac it's Command, Shift-I, and it will invert the selection. And now, because I'm not worried about filling with specularity and I don't want it to fill with black, I want to fill this area. So what I'll do is I'll go to Freeze and say Fill in Frozen. Or I can press the Insert key. So if I press the Insert key, I'm painting in this red material. And if I press Control D, I will now deselect anything in the scene, everything in the scene, so that nothing is frozen, nothing's masked, and I have just the body affected. Let me press Control Z and go back to that selection. I'll invert it again by doing Command or Control Shift I, and I'm going to press X to flip my colors, and I'll press Insert again. And in this case, I have my spider filled with black. Now, I'm fortunate enough to know that because of the problem of filling with specularity, it's going to fill with black. But because of the fact that I'm trying to fill it with black anyway, I'm actually going to let that happen. So in this case, I don't want the spider at 70% specularity. I want it about 17, and I'll press Insert again. And so this makes the spider's overall body somewhat shiny. In fact, I'll make it a little bit more than that. Press Insert again. And so now, if I press Control D, we have the eyes and we have the body mostly painted, if not painted completely. It depends on how much detail you want to put in there. But let's say I want to paint just these little pincers here, and I want to make them white. So what I'll do is I'll click on this color, I'll change it to white or any color I want here, and at this point I could just paint in here and try to get these pincers white that way. But I want to show you the E panel and how you can use it to affect your painting. So I'm going to choose either type E or press this button here, and I'm going to choose a non-uniform or box, that I can scale around a certain area. And if I do that and draw that box around here, I should get this information painted into this area. Now, actually, as I'm thinking about it, I just messed something up. And this is good for me to go through, because you're going to run into this and say, wait, that was all on the spiders layer? And so what I should have done is chosen spider and filled with black, which I'll go back to black, and take this back up to 70%, and invert my selection and press insert. Okay. Now let's go to this other layer down here. I'm going to double click on it and type pincers. Okay. Now what that does, in fact, let me turn my helper off for a second. What that does is allow me now to paint on the whatever area of the screen that I want without affecting, it's not true. I can affect the entire scene at once, but I'm putting whatever I'm painting now on this layer. So what I'll do is I'll change my paintbrush to white, and I'll go to the, I'll uncheck ignore back faces, because what will happen is if I paint up in the front area here as I'm seeing it, if I were to flip it upside down, it would still be black underneath, and that's not what I want. So I should be able to use this tool to paint this in, and if for some reason it's not working, in this case, it could be user error, but I don't think it is. It looks like there might be a bug here. So like I said, it's not a perfect program, but most of the time this type of feature works. So I'm going to try a different tool. And that's interesting that I know exactly what happens. What's happening, it's working exactly like it's supposed to, but my layer is underneath the black that I painted for the spider. So if I bring it up one, now we have it. So it definitely was user error. In fact, I'm going to go backwards here. I'm going to go forwards by pressing Control Y. And I'm going to move the pincers up, deselect, press E, use my box, and draw in my color. So now I very quickly painted in another detail into the model. If I want to clear a layer, let's say the spider, I can go to Layers with that layer selected and use Erase Unfrozen, or it says I can press Delete. Now I'm going to turn down the light intensity because it's really intense here. And let's say I want to add, some undercoat. So let's give this this spider a base color that's sort of dark. In fact, let me get off my E panel for a second. Oh, I just did it again. So let's go with Erase Unfrozen, and I'm going to go to my E panel and choose a brush. And I'm going to paint with a gray color this time. Let's turn off the specularity. So this will be my undercoat. And what I'm going to do now is choose a, let's say a brownish color. Let's go with something that's sort of a reddish brown. Let's make it that color. Okay, so let's choose a different brush type, and we're going to paint in areas on top of that. We can do that, but it looks kind of off. And so the next tool that I want to show you is the airbrush tool, which is the third one down. I tend to use that a lot. The second one is the pencil tool, and it does what it sounds like. It's a sharper line than the brush, but I almost never use it. The airbrush will allow me to soft paint areas, so I don't actually have to have a strong, and you can change opacity under brush and get more or less the same effect, but I find the airbrush is just a little bit more tweakable. It's not as intense, and so I can get this information in here without being overly strong about it, and maybe give this thing fur or whatever, scales, skin pores, whatever the subject that you're dealing with is that you're painting and what you're trying to get out of it. Okay, so the next thing I tend to work with is let me redo that, is go to this next brush down, which is a tool options palette that it brings this up where I can saturate or desaturate. So I tend to use this on occasion, depending on what I'm trying to do, to saturate, desaturate, darken, lighten, sharpen, smoothing, etc. Change the effect of the areas that I'm painting on that layer. It's one that I use tentatively because there are times when it's sort of more destructive or more harmful to the design that I'm trying to do than otherwise. So it is at times detrimental to use it because it's hard to go back. But then having said that, actually the level of undos in this application are actually pretty high, so I wouldn't be too concerned. And then you have, I showed you the eraser tool. You also have the freeze tool. So you don't have to freeze an object, you can freeze an area. And if you don't like the way the freeze looks, you can toggle the freeze view by pressing Alt F or clicking on this. And so instead of it being that sort of checkered look, I can keep pressing Alt F and you can see that I get different effects for what a frozen area is going to look like. And of course, Control D will deselect it. And so those are the main tools that I tend to use. The only other one that I tend to use is the text tool. And I'm not saying these other ones aren't useful. I just tend to use these probably more often than anything else. The text tool is interesting because you can click based on the size of your, let me turn this light down just a bit. You can turn your, move your cursor left and right to size your brush, or up and down to increase or decrease the level of your strength. But in this case, when we're dealing with the text tool, we're not worried about the strength so much as the size of the cursor. So if I make it really big and click, you'll see I get a certain size of text. If I were to not do that and press it when my cursor's smaller, I get smaller text. And if I need to adjust it after the fact, I'll just float my cursor over one of these spline points and size it the same way I would my other cursor, my standard brush. And when I'm ready to commit this, well, let's try this too. In fact, that's another point I wanted to make as well, is if you press the space bar, you actually get this pop-up for different tools. But so let's say I want to move this text. I can actually slide these to meet my needs. And if I hold Shift, I can slide the whole thing. So another thing is you'll notice that nothing has been committed to the scene yet. I have to hit Enter, and it will commit the paint job to the scene. If I hit Escape now, you'll see that that's been painted onto the model. And if for some reason I didn't want it to be some text, and I wanted to give my own text to this, let me slide this down a little bit. Then instead of saying some text, I can say spider or whatever. And if I type that in over here and press Enter over here, then it should commit. And if for some reason it didn't, then I couldn't tell you why. Let's try this again. Enter. That's odd. It does not seem to be committing. So this could be a bug that I just found, but that should still work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change my tool and then change it back and see if that works. Huh. That's interesting. So it could be that I needed to choose a different setting here. I can erase text, freeze text, make it plainer, set absolute height if you're painting with depth, but this is a paint and extrude. It should work. So I don't know if maybe this modulator got messed up somehow. Let's try that. Okay, that's what happened. So for some reason it went from 1 to 0 or something. So I'm going to put that back at 1 and press Enter. It's definitely not a bug on my bug. So in this case, I've changed the text. So I'm not stuck with that. Another thing I can do is use these curves. If I want to paint, I can paint along these curves, and I can use the W key, not the W key, the cursor over these and move them around with my left mouse button. My right mouse button will adjust the width and the narrowness of these splines. And then if I hit Enter, it should paint along that area. That's one I don't use very often, but it is something to know. And if for some reason you need to turn that off, just hit the Escape key. And I guess that's most of what I wanted to show you, other than let's just look at the depth painting for a second here. If I turn off the color and just go with the depth, in fact, let's just keep the color on, but let's choose something a little bit more interesting. Let's go with this Just go with sort of a grayish color. And let's use this map here. If I wanted to paint, let's change my brush to a smooth brush. If I wanted to paint this information onto my spider, I can, using that image. And what it's done is it's painted the information onto the spider using a dark color. If I want that to show up a little bit better, I'll just lighten my color and paint in there. And you'll see that it's been painted onto it. If I want more depth information, let's turn it up to 60 and paint in here. You'll see that I have a certain amount of resolution that occurs here. Now it may be blurry, and that might be because when I turned the bake in, when I did the bake operation, I chose a low resolution. If you go under Retopo, and if I were not flying through those menus, you could see where it says 1024 by 1024. That's what I used. If for some reason you want something higher to paint with better resolution, if you're using, say, the same merge with normal map per pixel painting, you can do that. But then you're going to want to use, say, 2048 by 2048 or 4096 by 4096. And you may be limited depending upon what license you have. I think the trial version limits you to 2048 by 2048, if I'm not mistaken. The other thing I tend to choose here is don't snap with subdivision vertices to the surface, and this can fix some bake errors. So if for some reason I needed more resolution and I knew this was going to be an elephant skin or whatever the thing I was going to do to it, sometimes it's better to apply these in the voxel room here, sculpt it in, and then go to the paint room after you're done with everything there. And then you'll see that you have better resolution of the normal map there. It'll be projected with more accuracy. It'll look better. So that's something to keep in mind. There are times when you're going to want to paint details in the voxel room. It's not so much in the voxel room, but you can literally paint on the voxel, as you've seen here. I've painted on the voxel, even though I've been painting in the Retopo. I'm sorry, the paint room on the Retopo model. This is not the voxel, but I've been painting on this one. But at the same time, I've been painting on the voxel. And usually, when you're in that workflow, it doesn't matter so much, but there are ways to paint details into the voxels and then project those in later on, and you'll get more accuracy in terms of how sharp they look. So let's see if there's anything else I can cover here for you. Like in the voxel room, you can change the perspective, the grid, the axis if you need to. The other thing is you can change the camera settings. So you can go front, back, right, rotate around, different navigations here. And I think that's pretty much it. I think I've covered enough in the paint room to get you started. If you have any questions, feel free to ask.